It's a pleasure to be here. I have to tell you, I'm not in a position to talk about FinTech overall. It's a very broad subject. We have no idea what parts of the financial sector are going to look like in 10 years from now, let alone in 20. We can only have some guesses how new business models and new technologies and perhaps new regulation are going to shape the sector. So I'm not going to pretend I know things that I don't. And that's why in my presentation I'm going to stick a little bit on it's not even regulation, it's an initiative report where I've prepared a draft. We're working currently in the Econ Committee in Parliament on finalizing an initiative report on virtual currencies and perhaps more importantly, distributed ledger technology, which you kindly mentioned. And perhaps using this example, we can then at least I will try to draw some conclusions on how regulation and innovation in this area can go hand in hand. And there's one obvious, before I go into the details, one obvious observation. Of course, regulation is there to protect citizens, to protect customers, to assure the efficient and competitive working of the economy. Regulation is not so much about protecting incumbents from innovation. And I think it's always useful to go back to first principles on that and make certain that this is not forgotten. And I think to the extent that we manage to do that, regulation and innovation can go hand in hand very well indeed. But of course, as we all know, in the political process, and some of your job it may be to help incumbents perhaps shape regulation. So there's an inherent tension. But I think for as long as we go back to the first principles, we'll be on the safe side. Now, on distributed ledger technology, there's enormous potential. It has the potential to transform in many ways, whether it's transfer funds, whether it's a clearing and settlement in financial transactions, but far beyond that, whether it's you wishing to sell a song that you bought on the internet to sell it on, or one expert from MIT gave us the example of selling on an electronic ticket that you bought for a baseball or football game. And then the question is, what happens if you sell it 5 times? Now, of course, with distributed ledger technology, you can actually trace the transaction and you can settle it and you sell it once and it's going to work and there are not going to be 5 people standing in front of the stadium. So there are all kinds of applications that one can imagine. And if done well, transaction costs could go down significantly. In many of the areas that FinTech is about. Part of FinTech is about transferring money. Part of FinTech is about making transactions, for example, in the stock market easier. Part of FinTech is about easing the access to finance. And many, sort of in the engine room, many of these things can be enhanced by the use of distributed ledger technology. I even mentioned in a draft report applications of governments, because of course governments, they're not only regulators, but they're potentially also users of such innovations. And one use one could imagine, it's speculative. I wish to emphasize this because there's some journalists in the room, so I'm not saying this is what the future is going to look like. But it's possible to imagine that, for example, tracing VAT transactions could be done using blockchain technology, and that would considerably reduce the scope for VAT fraud, which continues to be a big problem. So there are all sorts of applications that one could imagine. Now, of course, hand in hand with these opportunities go certain risks. And if you think about virtual currency application, there are some obvious risks that have to do with money laundering, for example, that may have to do with criminal activities, a little bit like you could imagine having it for cash. But it goes beyond that. And let me give you an example, and I also gave it in Parliament recently. The example of a new innovation in transferring messages. For a long time, people were using SMSs, and then all of a sudden, people started using WhatsApp. And that spread very, very rapidly. And when WhatsApp was already very big, a serious security problem with WhatsApp was discovered. Now, that may not be such a problem for text messages. Hopefully, they're not that mission critical to anybody. But still, I mean, it was a serious concern. Just imagine you had this sort of technological problem with a new technology like distributed ledger technology or any other one that is already in widespread use, and all of a sudden you get this major vulnerability. That would be dangerous. I mean, that would be potentially systemic. So that's something we need to worry about. Does the technology really deliver with the security that we require, with the certainty that we require, the services that are expected? And when you think about computer code, there are all kinds of things that might be going on in the background. And so that is a cause for concern. And documentation and our ability to unwind faulty transactions, of course, they're things that need to be borne in mind. So when we adopt these new technologies, these are more fundamental things we need to worry about. Another fundamental thing that came up with distributed ledger technology, but may be relevant for other areas of FinTech as well. The dream of the architects of the Bitcoin was to have a completely decentralized system without a governance structure, because the idea was the software would be so perfect that it would never, ever have to be changed. And that's why you didn't need a governance structure. Now, it turned out there was a problem. There was a problem with the Bitcoin software, and you actually needed to change the software to make it more workable. But the question was then, well, who would decide? How would you decide it? Would some people all of a sudden update the software? Well, if you could do that, perhaps you could alter the rules of the game more fundamentally. For example, currently in Bitcoin, there's a limited number of Bitcoins that could ever be mined in the lifetime of the system. If you can all of a sudden change the software just because of a couple of key players in the area decide to update, well, you can change the rules of the game. But how? There's no governance structure. That can, if there's a problem, that can be very dangerous. That can create a lot of legal uncertainty. It can hurt potentially lots of the users very badly. So again, we mustn't be naive about some of the promises that are being made in that area. So that's something we need to worry about. You seem to have a question. No? Yes, or your neighbor? No. Well, yes, but as you know, there was no clear mechanism by which this would be done. And one of the founding fathers of Bitcoin, actually before this was finally agreed, because there was no clear voting mechanism or anything like that, one of the founding fathers of Bitcoin said, well, I think the system is going to be dead because we can't agree on it. And only then did the different actors manage to agree on it. So there's no formalized decision-making process that creates legal certainty. And again, I mean, this software change, as far as I'm aware, there is no legal certainty surrounding this because it's a completely decentralized system. But I'm happy to discuss it a little bit further. I'm sure you followed this closely. I followed this closely. And there was a major governance issue involved, which hadn't been anticipated. All right, so what does all of this mean in terms of regulation? What can governments, what can the European Parliament do in such a context? Well, obviously, we don't want to stifle innovation. We don't want to come up with all sorts of preemptive pieces of regulation that would stop things that we don't even know about, which might be very beneficial from emerging. So that's clear. But does that mean we shouldn't do anything? I mean, some people talk about light touch regulation, which is a different way of saying, well, we shouldn't be doing too much and only act as a kind of repair team once a crash has happened. I don't think that's a good approach either. What I'm suggesting is a very strong element of precautionary monitoring. So the government needs to know, basically, as well as investors and users, and in many cases much more than ordinary users, about what's actually going on. Is this a sound system? There needs to be more transparency in business models and software and so on. There needs to be a level of expertise on the side of the government that would then, once we see on a significant scale things going wrong, would enable the regulator, would enable governments to react very swiftly. And if need be, then rein in very harshly. So the idea is, and that's one of the suggestions that the draft report makes, is to install a distributed ledger task force at the European level, which would also act as a service provider to national regulators where appropriate, and also for more specialized European regulators on the technicalities of this new software, of this new technology, and also be in a much better position to quickly come up with regulatory proposals. And yes, so and I think this idea can be generalized to other potential fintech areas, sort of off the cuff, and that's really my closing remark. Thinking about peer-to-peer lending, it's one of the big areas in fintech today. One of the worries I would have as an economist, this is actually not a technological observation, as an economist, is we know from the old days there's such a thing as the winner's curse. You know, the classic textbook example you probably teach your students or some colleague when you try to auction off an oil well to the highest bidder. Routinely, the bidder who won the auction had bid too high because you had all these different expectations in the room, and the one who happened to be the most optimistic one made it. Probably the better prediction for the true value of the oil well would have been the average view of the crowd. But of course, only the highest bidder, the most optimistic one, would systematically get it. Now, think about it. If you have peer-to-peer lending, and if you have people who are not aware of the winner's curse, you could have a very systematic problem. It wouldn't be a very long-lived business proposition. Perhaps some of the lending activities that are going on may be a result of this. So, in other words, this precautionary monitoring may not only have to look at technologies, it may also have to look in an intelligent way at business models, again, to enable governments, when need be, when things are starting to become systemic, to rein in. Thank you very much, and I'm much looking forward to the discussion.